thank you for joining us for the latest Innovation Forum webinar. For this one, we'll be looking at field to field, scaling regenerative practices beyond pilots to wide adoption, the big question in the area of regen ag. My name is Tanya Richard. I'm COO and Head of Stakeholder Engagement at Innovation Forum, which means that I get the pleasure to be moderating these sort of conversations and asking the questions that I have to fantastic speakers. Just to take a moment to thank Eugenia, Mike, the full Vayda team for making this webinar possible, and also to my colleagues Savannah and Ellen for all your work in putting this together. We know the importance of hosting these conversations, so I appreciate all the hard work. And also thank you to USFRA for your continued partnership and helping bring farmers and putting them at the center of these sort of conversations. So thank you to you behind the scenes as well. We've been holding these sort of conversations at our events and webinars and podcasts and conferences. You'll see some familiar faces in the webinar here, but really trying to see how we can bring the farmer perspective to the forefront. We really see the importance in that. So with that being said, I'm joined by a fantastic panel for this. We've got John Griffel in Illinois, a farmer based in Illinois, Bill Parks, a farmer based in Mississippi, Mike, the CEO of Vayda, joining us, and then Greg Borer at Walmart. So really sort of a well-rounded perspective, a well-rounded panel that we'll get to pick their brains of for the next hour or so. So for the next hour, we'll start off a little bit with first talking about the challenges. Let's name the challenges and then we can try and solve them a little bit. So I'll be sort of going around and around robin, seeing what are the challenges that you're facing from your perspective, from your place in the value chain, and then going into more detail to see what the solutions are out there. How can we work together? We have a really great audience. I'm already seeing sort of hundreds of people trickling through, listening into this. So we can try and figure out how we can solve it as a panel of 5, but really we want to get your perspectives, your questions, and I'm addressing the audience here, really get your feedback as well. So as we go through the webinar, please ask your questions in the Q&A. This is your opportunity to get feedback from a lot of people that you're probably trying to connect with on the daily. So put your questions in the Q&A, keep them as short and succinct as possible, just means I don't have to be trying to multitask too much, address them to a speaker wherever possible, and also just don't leave it to the end. We always get through the best questions at the end, and then we have to hurry around this fantastic panel. So upvote as well. If you see a question that maybe sounds similar to yours, upvote another one, and then I can try and get to that one first. So yeah. Without further ado, this is sort of the housekeeping notes. I'd love to turn to Mike first. Kind of introduce yourself, Vayda. Why are you wanting to hold this sort of conversation? Why is this important? And then from your perspective, from your place in the value chain, what are you currently seeing as the biggest barriers to scaling regen ag? Over to you, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Michael Shoemaker. As Tanya said, I'm the CEO of Vayda. And Vayda is an agronomic services and technology company, and we are very specifically focused on regenerative agriculture and regenerative transitions. And so for us, that means that we partner with growers to help them introduce these practices and principles on their farms in a way that makes sense for their farm, that's tailored to and optimized for every single field on the farms that they manage. And so today we are focused principally on the mid-south of the United States. Mississippi and Arkansas is where we have our greatest footprint. And we work with growers who are managing around 130,000 total acres of farmland in those 2 states. And so we're working with them on what we would consider to be core regenerative practices, things like cover crops, reduced or no-till practices, as well as nutrient management, and crop rotations and crop diversity. So that's really our focus. And the services and technology that we work on and that we deliver to growers is really an outgrowth of how we got started. So Vayda started its life as a company, as a farming company. And so as a farming company with a dedication to commitment to regenerative practices. And so from the very beginning, we have had to wrestle with all of the very nuanced and complex management decisions that a grower faces day in, day out. Some of these decisions are large, some are small, but all important decisions as it relates to how do you introduce these sometimes very novel management practices on a farm in a way that doesn't put the farm at risk, that doesn't significantly jeopardize yield and profitability. And so, we had several years of kind of dealing with that complexity. And I guess in some ways it shouldn't have been a surprise to us. It probably shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this call, in the sense that if you look at the most well-known farmers in regenerative agriculture, they all they're now in a position where they've seen great success from these practices, but it was over many years of incremental change at great pains and often through a lot of trial and error. And we thought to ourselves, well, that's interesting, but it won't be the basis for widespread adoption and practice change. We can't expect every grower to take the level of risk that some of these early adopter innovator growers took. And so we decided to dedicate ourselves to this work of providing this agronomic support to growers in a way that's really tailored to optimize for their farm. So I think that's a little bit of who we are, what we do, and I think that starts to speak to, Tanya, some of the challenges that we see is I think there's been some significant improvement in this regard, but we still see a pretty overwhelming focus on incentives. And this idea that we need to figure out how to better structure incentives, or how do we increase the level of incentive so that we can stimulate more widespread practice change and adoption. And while we are no opponent of incentives, we see the financial de-risking aspect of this is really critical. We think that, and what we hear from the growers that we work with, is that this operational and agronomic de-risking, and then ultimately the optimization of the use of these practices so they can deliver greater profitability on the farm, that's really what's going to drive the kind of long-term sustainable practice change. And so that's part of the reason why we wanted to bring this group together. It's one of the challenges that we continue to see is that probably
I think we're losing you, Mike. Can you hear us? Okay, we lost you for a second there, Mike.
Well, not sure where I cut out, but I think just kind of closing out there is how do we increase the emphasis on de-risking this operationally, agronomically for growers, and as we say, it's making the practices pay as opposed to just paying for practices. Okay,
great. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm noting down all the challenges that we go through, and then we'll see how we can, like, what similarities we see across all of your opinions as well. Maybe Bill, going to you, introduce yourself, the work that you do, where do you operate, what sort of commodities are you operating in, and then as a farmer implementing these sort of regenerative practices, what has your experience been in the transition so far? What have the biggest obstacles been? And then we can go from there. Over to you, Bill. And you're on mute, just by the way.
Lips are moving, but you don't hear anything. Good morning. Glad to be here and glad to have everyone here listening and interested about this topic. Bill Parks. I'm from Mississippi. Basically, the Mississippi Delta is where I'm from. If you're not familiar with it, we're about 200 miles long, about 80 miles wide, and I sit somewhere in the central southern region of that, in a little town called Belzona. Catfish capital of the world. And ironically, I'm allergic to catfish. So yeah, that's kind of been a thing growing up there when I tell people about that. Other than that operation, I'm a third generation farmer, where we rotate through corn, soybeans, we have rice, also a little wheat in the mix, no catfish. And that's pretty much what we do. And like I said, most of the land around here, as just a kind of a geographical sense of where we are, as in a delta, we are flat. So the challenges we have there, especially this year, this is my first year into Vayda. I'm really excited about that. This spring, and as I guess everyone knows from all around the U.S., we've had a wet spring, and over 42 inches has failed in my area, and 25 of those inches has failed since I planted corn 1st of March. And so it's been a challenge working in and out with the with the regenerative practices that I've put forth has been a challenge, with the ground being a little more saturated, planting conditions marginal. So working through that has been. But at one time, of course, the few bad things, a few of the positive things I've had, where we did get into the ground, where we had the cover crops and stuff, the ground was firmer. We were able to plant in a little better condition, but it was mixed. It's kind of all over the board where we're at this year, but pretty much that's where we're at. That's where I'm at with all of this, and we're still continuing and learning. It's a learning process where, you know, each day and each year we're figuring it out. So we're excited to be here and excited to hear y'all and everyone and the questions that you have for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. John, from your side, also a farmer on this panel, introduce yourself, where you're operating, what commodities you're operating in, and sort of what has this looked like for you? Are you in the transition? What stage are you at? And what challenges are you still facing, if so?
Yeah, hi. So I'm John Griffel. I'm located in central Illinois, about halfway between Springfield, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. I farm with my dad. I'm the sixth generation on our family farm, and we grow corn, soybeans, occasionally wheat, but then also have a beef cattle herd that we grow hay for. Everything the cattle eat, with the exception of protein lick tubs, comes from our farm. We feed directly through, and then we sell about 70% of that directly to consumer. We are not a part of any type of pilot program or a type of any other program to move into regenerative agriculture. We've just always looked at ourselves as stewards of the land. So we've implemented cover crops in highly erodible soil, and we've done it at a slow basis. We haven't moved at a quick pace because whenever we talk about the de-risking and the financial side, we couldn't jump in with both feet. We've been doing it over a number of years and seeing what works and what doesn't, because there's a number of learning steps to go along the way. And one of the bigger barriers that we found is the education on the side of it, because there's a variety of opinions, and most of the research and most of the things that I've based mine on is off of reading books, it's off of reading blogs, it's off of reading things like that, and just trying it on a small scale. So we've implemented programs like buffer strips, and we do cover crops anywhere that's highly erodible. We do cover crops on all those acres, and then we do cover crop buffer strips around the edges of fields to try and, you know, hold as much of that soil in as we can. And like Bill said, we are seeing a difference, especially with that rain this year, of that compaction holding that soil together is really keeping our topsoil still in that field. We do things like variable rate fertilizers. So we're not wasting fertilizer in spots that don't need it. We're doing soil testing and testing for nitrogen and other things like that to make sure that our inputs are staying in our fields. But most of what we've done is just kind of read about it, hear about it, research it a lot, and then try and put it on 3 or 4 acres and give it a try and see how it works.
Great. Thank you. Okay, and then Greg, to sort of round out the panel, introduce yourself, your work at Walmart. What does regenerative agriculture really look like at Walmart at the moment? What projects are you focusing on? And then from a retailer perspective, it'd be interesting to hear what obstacles are you facing?
Well, first off, thanks for having me to Innovation Forum. Thanks, Michael, for inviting me in. Yeah, so I work for Walmart. I'm the Director of Natural Capital at Walmart and Walmart.org, which means I really have 2 jobs. The first job at Walmart.org is a philanthropic job. So we have a grant program focused on nature and climate, and my responsibility is to drive the regenerative transition through enabling grants to nonprofits here in the United States. So I work all over the country, but primarily here in the Midwest and the Great Plains, working with farmers and ranchers and figuring out what are the gaps that we have in the system that need to be filled by philanthropy to allow the supply chain to make investments and drive the transition. On the other side of the equation, on the Walmart side of the equation, I work to help drive our strategy on achieving our nature commitments. So back in 2020, our CEO, Doug McMillan, made a commitment for Walmart to become a regenerative company. And we know it's going to be a long journey. Regenerative agriculture is part of that journey. But the metric for that journey is whether by 2030, we are able to help protect, restore, or more sustainably manage 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean. So my job is to think about our shared value vision, both working through Walmart, the business, many of you probably know, and Walmart Foundation on the philanthropic side to fill those gaps in the system and drive progress forward. What that means for regenerative agriculture is a vision of outcomes-based progress. So when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we're not talking about any specific practice. We work through the idea of soil health principles and things that are generally scientifically accepted to build resilience, build soil health, and build profitability for farmers as sort of outcomes that we want to get to. But we're practice agnostic. And the reason we do that is because even just talking to this panel, my family farm is from Jacksonville, Illinois, which is not that far from Jonathan. I used to live in Minnesota, not that far from Michael, and now I'm in Arkansas, just across the Ozarks from the Delta region. All three of those are wildly different farming situations, and the context really, really matters. So if we went out there and said, these are the practices that we want you to implement, we'd never get consensus on it. We'd never get progress on it. So context is really important in our regenerative journey for regenerative agriculture. And what we want to do is work with the farmers and the ranchers to figure out what are the things that will make a difference for them, that will lead to better outcomes for people, for our customers, for farmers, for the planet, for climate, all these different co-benefits that we're trying to drive, and then focus in on how do we make that happen, whether it's through technical assistance, through financial incentives, or through market development. So that's what we do. To get into like why what the problems are, there's so many, and I really had a hard time answering this question as it was posed before we started here. But the biggest one from a retailer's perspective is we're very far with the farmer. We are at the very end of the supply chain. We're the shelf, right? And so we rarely have a direct connection with the farmers who are growing the commodities or the products that go into what comes to our shelf. So we have to work through the supply chain, and a million points of light, a million different farms, or a million different pilots on a million different farms. That's a very expensive way to drive scale, drive change at scale. And so we need to foster greater collaboration in specific landscapes where the need is great. And so we're looking to your point of like, where are we going? We're looking at specific landscapes across the United States where we have a concentration of production that's really important to us, particular commodity, and then a natural capital risk. It could be groundwater in the Delta region. It could be dryland farming and trying to build soil health in Minnesota and in Illinois. It could be a lot of different things, but what it is essentially focus on the natural resource risks that may impact our customers down the line and the ability of us to service them with products that are provided at a good price. And try to, as much as possible, foster collaboration across the supply chain in that landscape for change, and then through that drive scale, because at a certain point we believe that we can get to a tipping point where regenerative agriculture is just the way that things are done around here, and that drives a whole network and ecosystem of supporting businesses and services and farmer networks and all those kind of things. And if you can get to that, you're no longer pushing the boulder uphill, you're actually chasing it downhill, which is what we want to be able to get to. So that difficulty of being very far away and having to work through other actors to make change, that's hard, because everybody wants to do their own thing. They want to go fast, they want to have control. But collaboration, you have to give up control, you have to move slower, but at the end of the day, you get the change at scale that you're looking to make. So that's what I do. Thanks again for having me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you very much. I've been trying to put it together, and I'm already seeing questions come through from the audience, which really appreciate that. So I think maybe for the next 40 minutes, what I'm seeing as the main patterns sort of starting to evolve is one, de-risking. So the challenge being risk for the farmers in the transition. How do we de-risk that? Looking at the financial de-risking, the incentive structure. How do we ensure that we look at what are the correct practices, and then how do we make sure that those are scaled, and then how do we sort of bring other farmers into that as well, and teach them or share best practices with other farmers. And then that point that you mentioned, Greg, on sort of the multi-level value chain collaboration with companies that are further apart. How do we make sure that that communication and sort of best practice sharing is felt throughout? Yeah, just a quick call to the audience. Keep putting in your questions. I'll try and fit them into all of those as we move on. And then maybe at the end, it's sort of like a round of what other questions have we not sort of covered. So let's take that first one on sort of the de-risking the transition for farmers. How do we ensure that that transition makes practical, economic, timely sense for farmers, short-term, long-term incentives? I can start off actually, maybe Mike, there was a question from Flavio, excuse me, asking to briefly explain the phases included in the transition to a farm with regenerative agriculture, considering the issue of risk levels. So how do you work with farmers to de-risk that transition? Maybe we can start there.
Yeah. But I think it's already been said, but what specific practices are used and to what degree or how they're implemented is really going to be context specific. So we don't think about the phasing so much in those terms. We believe in implementing multiple practices that are complementary to each other, because that will help drive more immediate benefit. But when we think about the phased approach, it's probably more in line with what Jonathan was saying, where a grower will want to try this on a couple of fields in the first year. They're not going to bet the farm, so to speak, on these practices or any kind of program. So they'll, whether it's a few acres or one field or a couple of fields, there's I think well known within agriculture, this is a common way that farmers will try new things and de-risk the implementation or piloting of a new, whether it's a product or management practice. So yeah, we see that there's a first year, it might be a field or two, and then the way that we work with growers we will try to, we're focused really on protecting yield first and then driving out costs. And the way that we structure the transitions, we're pushing to have this be net better in terms of profitability for the grower in the first year, before taking into consideration any kind of incentive payments. And so our belief is that if we can help them achieve those kinds of results, that they'll just continue to double down on this. And that's how I should mention we farm about 5,300 acres across Mississippi and Arkansas. These are R&D and demonstration farms that we directly operate. And that's how we operate our farms, is if we have an idea that we think could help drive or accelerate the process, we'll implement it on one field in the first year. And if we find that it works or we discover how it can work, then we can try it on multiple fields. And by year 3, we're doing it across the entire farm. So that's probably more how we think about phasing than practice X is first, practice Y is second. We don't. There is a stacking that occurs, but really more, how do you trial this multiple things at the same time on a small portion of the farm?
Okay, great. John, did you want to add anything to that point, since it's bringing in a bit of your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's a great approach, and it's not an approach that farmers are not used to. I think that trial and error approach, they'll do it with different chemical programs. They'll do it with different fertilizer. They'll do it with different tillage methods. They'll do it with different seeds. So that's a method that's already working for them. So I think that's an easy way to relate. And I think that's a good approach that Vayda has of connecting with the farmer and relating with them. I think that's one of the keys, is relating to them. You don't want to come in and say, hey, you need to make this change. You want to come in and say, how can we work with you and work along the ways that they're already used to?
Yeah. And there was a question from Rebecca as well on that. When you're looking at that sort of trial stage, are there any sort of specific factors that you're looking at before you take the leap to go up? And they mentioned sort of test results, yield, soil. Are there specific measurements or data points that you're looking at?
At least from our side, adding in like the cover crops and doing things like that, we are waiting to get to the third year to do more soil tests and things like that on that ground to see what that difference is, rather than paying for those soil tests, because the first thing is looking at the profitability of it. Whenever we're implementing those cover crop systems, that's one of whenever you look at it based on the region, obviously, but it's one of those kind of introductory methods into regenerative farming. And it's one that people can adopt because people have put they'll plant wheat. It's the same time that they're already doing something in that vein. So it's an easy jumping off point. But relating to them and trying to get that the cover crops, it's an added expense for every acre we put it on, because we have to terminate it before we can plant. We don't know what the yields are going to be different because we've done a traditional tillage system and we know to expect this yield from it. But we have to go in, dig deeper into the numbers and really have a good concept of what it costs us for every acre. So we have to know, because we'll be adding in the cost of seed, but we'll be taking out, the cost of the fuel going across in the tillage. Like there's factors to be considered. And then what's the turnover point until we start to see that yield balancing out between that and the tillable acres.
Thank you. And from your perspective, Bill, if you wanted to comment on anything and add anything, but otherwise, what systems have you seen that work in de-risking the transition? How are you working with buyers, for example? What are those conversations looking like to explain to them what would work for you to make this actually work to scale? And you're on mute, just by the way.
Right. So, I guess what I'm seeing, and first off, I think communication is key. With the farmer himself, with the company, with Vayda, or with anyone, buyers and growers, communication is key, and knowing all the what possible troubles might come out of this, and of course all the benefits, and just having a clear view of that when you start with this, because as with farming and
Oh no.
there's a lot of money. It's new years. We have this with since I've put corn in the ground, you've got this new mix we have in with regenerative and trying to approach that. So just communicating and patience. Patience is also a big thing. Kind of unique to my situation where we are down south, in which I would love to see more, and maybe I'm not aware, as in relating to buyers and stuff. There's not many chains that we can deliver our crops to. It's just, I guess, the infrastructure or just where we what's down here, or I don't know of. Most of the things go to the ports, and then it's shipped downriver is where a lot of our crops go. I would love to see more things come into this area, where we could have
Oh no.
the chain. So yeah. So but for the most part, I think just patience and communication is the big thing.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We lost you for a little bit, but I think we got a good point. Maybe on that point, on sort of, I wonder if there's, when you were first approached about this and said, okay, there's this new thing called regenerative agriculture. How did, if someone, I'm getting a few questions in the audience of people who are growers and who are farmers, and they're looking for advice on how to first implement that. How do you speak with other farmers in your network? What are still sort of the skepticisms that you're seeing? How are you discussing with them to overcome those skepticism? And maybe to kind of paint a picture of what did that look like at the start for you? What got you to want to implement these sort of practices or trial these sort of practices in the first place? Bill or John, whoever wants to go first.
At least from my side, the reason that I wanted to jump back into it is that I'm in it for the long haul on it. But I also realize that a lot of the farmers that I talk to don't have that advantage. Our family has been on the same farm since 1856. I was lucky enough to come back to a healthy operation whenever I came back, and there's always going to be up and down years, but we've been able to continue to push through, and we always do take that forward approach. And so that's where the regenerative agriculture side fell in. But that's, like I said, that's an advantage that not everybody has. I know a number of farmers that whenever you talk about they're not a bad year or two, they are a bad year away. And then you talk about the number of people, especially I'm 30 years old, and you look at the number of people that are my age, that if you look at the numbers for farming, the average age for a farmer is like 64 years old. So within the next 25 years, they figure that somewhere between 50 and 66% of the people who are actively farming will either be retired or dead.
Mm.
So we have to address that as we, as a part of this is the younger generation coming in. We have such an eye that we have to be on the profitability side to maintain a healthy and functioning operation, but we also want to be in it for the long haul. And I know a number of people that more so now are working off-farm jobs and are working 2 jobs sometimes to come back and farm, and they care about the soil and they care about the things that are going. But you see a rise in the input costs and the land values, and Bill had talked about with markets, even not just market accessibility, but you talk about market prices. Last year we were looking in our area at 680 corn, and right now we're looking at 460 corn. So if I planted cover crops in the spring and figured, here's X numbers, here's my budget, I have this budget in for terminating them, and now all of a sudden 2/3 of my operating revenue is gone for nothing that I changed or controlled. So that type of volatility, Bill and I could work as hard as we want to. We could work twice as hard as we did last year, but it doesn't matter if the prices aren't there and that profitability stature isn't there.
Okay. Great. Bill, did you want to add anything on that, on sort of the skepticism, or how did that look like in the first place? What made you want to come on board for this?
Curious. I'm a curious farmer, if you want to say. I like to know the why to a lot of things, and you can quickly get lost on Google and just these blogs and everything, and it was intriguing, interesting, and so I had Vayda initially approach me, and I was like, sure, let's try it out. So the few acres that we got, and as you can see in my background, is one of the fields there. Me never doing cover crops or so, and so as you can see the jungle behind me, quote unquote, and today the beans, that field was planted in soybeans, because this is a cover crop of vetch, cereal, and some oats, I believe, with a few turnips. Soybeans look phenomenal right now, and our check strip, which is directly beside it, they're hand in hand. Both of them are looking great. Like I said, try small, start small, and have a little faith and a little patience, and just give it a try, because you never know. It might work out, and it's a trial and everything. As in, all the farmers know that each year is not going to be the same, and so just giving it a try and going forward, and as it was said, the long term, looking into it, and for soil health, and ultimately growing my crop or all of the crops as efficiently as possible, with the least amount of resources being used on it.
I mean, Mike, from your perspective, obviously you've worked with Bill, but then from your other work with farmers across the country, what are you seeing as still sort of the skepticisms or the sort of barriers to entry, and how does that communication then work with farmers to try and overcome those?
I think a lot of the skepticism and concern is around yield loss, as we've touched on, and to Jonathan's point, commodity prices are significantly down. If you're also kind of wading into something that risks material yield loss, it's hard, if not impossible, to make up for that at the level of the farm in terms of the farm's profitability. So we focus on how can we drive out costs, use these practices that have really historically, the core practices of things like cover crops and reduced or no-till have been used as an erosion control measure to a very large degree. But the benefits that can be generated from these kinds of practices, if implemented well, or go well beyond that, and we think are really quantifiable in a way that can help growers systematically reduce costs, whether that's, as Jonathan mentioned, fuel savings from fewer tillage passes and applications, or we see actually some really great opportunity for early gains in reducing herbicide. If you're getting good weed suppression from your cover crops, there's opportunity through nutrient management programs and also through cover crops to drive down your synthetic fertilizer use. So I think one of the challenges is a lot of growers have viewed these practices through a relatively narrow lens of either they will increase soil health over the long run, or they're a soil erosion control measure. But both of those are they take a longer time. It takes a longer time for the benefits to manifest, and it's harder to quantify just how much benefit you're getting. But the cost and the risk is very clear, and it's upfront. right? And so I think that's where the kind of cynicism or skepticism is coming from. Is I see risk of yield loss, I see added expense of cover crop seed, and the benefits are intangible and longer term. But that's probably more, for at least from our perspective, that's just the state of things. It's not a necessary reality. The reality can be that you can get immediate benefits from these in a way that makes sense in the first year.
Yeah. And maybe to zoom out a little bit, Greg, from your perspective, do you have anything that you wanted to add to what anyone has said so far? But then also from what is Walmart doing to sort of de-risk that transition or reduce the risk in that transition period in terms of yield loss and other, especially in that short term?
I think one of the things so certainly incentives help, right? Like financial incentives to make the transition easier when you need to buy new inputs or you need to change equipment or whatever it might be. That's important, and it helps to de-risk the transition for those who are focused on sort of how does it net out. But I think the human factor is just as important. So we talked about how you might try it on a 3 or 4 acres and you might scale up to a field, and then if that really works well, then you might try it on that operation, and it's a progression. But if you're doing it by yourself, you're making the same mistakes that everybody else already made, right? Like you're just repeating them because you're trying it out first and you're not talking to others. And so the human element of being able to talk to others who have gone through those mistakes before you, learn from them before you have to make them, that'll make the process a lot less risky for you. And so some of what I do is investing in that human capital on the landscape. An example of this would be with Practical Farmers of Iowa. As I was seeing the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodity Grants start to get announced and start to see like the landscape of, there's going to be a massive investment, particularly in the Midwest, particularly around cover crops as a practice. Do we have the infrastructure, both human and actual just crop seed? And it wasn't apparent to me that we did. So we might have this huge demand spike and not enough people to service it. So I worked with Practical Farmers of Iowa, gave them a grant to scale up a program called basically a cover crop business accelerator program, which helps farmers across Iowa who are interested in diversifying their business grow crop seed, harvest and clean it, and then sell or custom apply it to their neighbors, to their customers. And the idea being, one, we're going to increase the supply of cover crop seed across Iowa in a very localized manner. So it's going to be seed grown in the county, used in the county, right? And then secondly, those are folks who are going to be experts in doing this in a particular locality with particular climate, the particular soil, the particular, they know the network of in the system that exists there. They're going to be able to help their clients be successful because those clients are going to go from the 3 or 4 acre plot to that full field plot to then being a customer for their entire farm. It's in everybody's best interest. And so if you can create those sort of win-win situations where you can have the human capital there, have the incentive there, because this is paired up with incentive programs for Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, and make sure that the cost of the input is low enough to make sense, then you're de-risking it across multiple factors. And so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to invest in from the philanthropic side, is trying to see where the system gaps might start to emerge and really hold back the progress that everybody's driving, and then bridge that with human capital or other things that make it easier for the farmers to do what they want to do and not have to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Yeah.
I think there you can kind of tie together points that Bill made and then also that Greg made about whenever I really like the idea that you had, Greg, with taking it to actual farmers and then letting those farmers implement it and then talk with people around them. Because as Bill could probably relate to too, farming is a relationship business. There are people that they've worked with the same agronomist, they've worked with the same seed salesman. They're not looking at outside vendors to go to and change their business models. They work with people that they trust and work with people they're comfortable with. And that's one of the things that, as we talk about, we have to have these practices have staying power, because as people can relate to, even in any other workplace, if a new manager comes in and that manager is bad, people just don't start adopting the practices that the manager wants to put in because they'll say, well, I'll just outlast them. And that's what we've kind of had in agriculture in the past. we've had different initiatives come through, but we're always skeptical to adopt because they change in a 3 or 4 year period. The ideas and the concepts and the principles behind them change, and we're left either holding the bag or we're saying, well, we'll just outweight these practices and outweight this time. And I think that getting to the actual farmer and having them relate and be your message carriers is a really good concept and idea.
Can I add to that, Jonathan? Great point on that. And as I've said before, communication. I think tradition, what we've always done as a farmer, as Jonathan has said, that's what we're comfortable with. That's what we're trusting, because again, it is a lot of money tied up into these operations. And so also, I think that's a downfall, as in not per se being stuck in a rut, but just in the norm, everyday thing, and jumping out and trying new things. And because you never know until you do it. And that's where communication is important, patience, and trying these on small scales, and just trying them, and then just working from there. So, it can be good. And also, I think it can also hurt just a little bit.
Just to piggyback on that, I think there's a really important point in this, which is the transition, to call it that, has been, I think, too industry driven and not enough grower driven. And so, if we can get to a place where these practices are profitable, make sense on their own terms, this can become more of a grower led transition, and you get all the acceleration and benefits that you might be looking for as a industry player. But when it's really industry driven, this, to Jonathan and Bill's points, the growers are looking for signal. This is what we hear from them. They're looking for more signal from the market that this is real and that this is long lasting. And that signal would usually be in the form of some sort of a price premium or something to that effect. And they're going and they're talking to the elevators or the people at the delivery points, and they're not hearing that. Right. There are dollars that exist that are flowing through these regenerative ag programs, but it's not flowing through the supply chain, if that makes sense. And so I think that at a local level, and talking about local relationships, the conversation around regenerative ag is not yet one of like, yeah, this is real and this is something that we all need to start to prepare for and work on. There's skepticism and cynicism, Tanya, to your earlier question around this is industry led, but there's not signal yet really from the industry outside of these kind of marginal incentive programs that they're really serious about wanting us to do this. And I think that is something that, we all need to kind of really think about, be careful about in terms of how we approach this.
Well, and you have groups like USFRA that are connecting farmers and those businesses along the side to make it like a private enterprise type of funnel, a connection between those two. And I think that the key is the partnerships. It's not, if we wait for government to mandate these programs, it will take too long, because every time government implements something, they have to have 17 hearings and go through all these committees and budget. And we've all seen all of it. If we wait for that to happen, we'll be too late on these items and on these actionable steps. And I think that it needs to relate and come from those business sides. And that's where you can create those partners. And that's where, you have like Walmart doing the grants and doing things like that, creating those partnerships with farmers. Farmers can get behind partnerships. They can't get behind mandates. And that's what we want to create, those steps ahead of time and be proactive on it.
Yeah, it's a good point. And so it kind of ties to a question from Richard in the Q&A. He's saying, we have farmers here, we have retailer, we have data solution sort of implementers. So there are various people that should be involved in this, but some are maybe less or are sort of adverse to being incorporated in these conversations. Who should we be having in these sort of conversations much more? How do we get them involved? You mentioned government. How can we include that to make it, for bigger organizations, that if we're talking about incentives of bigger organizations, that's where government is an integral part there. So who is missing? How do we get them on board with this? Greg.
You saw me come off of mute on that one.
Yes.
So we talked about government, we talked about farmers and farm groups and the supply chain, retailer. But there's other, and then those who serve the farmers, right? The agronomists and the CCAs and all those others who are sort of in that role of providing services. But one of the big ones that's hanging out there that I don't think has really jumped into the conversation or jumped into the activities with both feet is the financial sector. And we've talked about de-risking and financial incentives and all those kind of things. Theoretically, the financial sector should be looking at this and saying, you know what, we have significant risks spread across farms that are exposed to severe weather and other things that will impact the ability of those farmers to pay back their loans, right? As Jonathan said, some farmers are one bad season away. That's a huge risk for those who are carrying loans from those lenders. So why aren't they jumping in and saying, you know what, we need to de-risk the transition too, because we ultimately will have better loan products, less risky loan products. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I think some of it is policy based in the way that we treat risk from a policy perspective. But I think also it's just not knowing where to engage, not knowing how to capture the value, but also share that value amongst the farmer, the financial services provider, and all the other players that we just mentioned. But if I was to ask like one sector to start to think about how to do this differently, it would be the financial services sector.
Yeah, definitely. We held a workshop recently on this sort of topic, and they brought up that AXA, for example, has a loan. I'm pretty sure it's AXA that has a regenerative agriculture loan system. That's a good first step, but it has, it still needs work of improvement, but it's still a good first step. But then also we held a workshop where we brought in the financial sector and farmers into a conversation in a workshop, and the conversations were just completely, it couldn't even start. Like, investors long term or in short term, and farmers think long term. So already, like, they start bringing to the table, and it's just completely off the conversation. So bringing that connection, and we're looking at Innovation Forum how we can bring in that sort of perspective together a lot more. But Mike, what did you want to add?
I fully agree with what Greg is saying. I'm extremely excited about the opportunity and possibilities there, because as you mentioned, for growers, whether it's crop insurance or their operating lines, mortgages, equipment leases, these are lifelines. And so to the extent that those can recognize the resilience of a regenerative operation, the decreased risk, and they can be priced and structured in a way that that is passes on those benefits to the grower. I think there's just a tremendous amount of potential there. I think the principal issue is just data. They're conservative, organizations that need lots of information from lots of different places in large quantities to come up with a price that's different from maybe the core loan product. And I think that's been the biggest issue. But I see a lot of actually interest and willingness from those groups to engage. I think they're just struggling with the relative lack of data that would allow them to take more aggressive action.
Yeah. I feel like maybe this is also a good time to bring in a question from Victor. He sort of was asking, another person that's maybe not involved in as much in these conversations are the sort of the C-suite, the higher ups. So getting that internal buy-in and the procurement teams. So that's a question to you, Greg, sort of how is that working with how are you integrating this into procurement policies, practices? What does that look like at Walmart in terms of getting that internal buy-in? We have a lot of people in our audience who are working at big companies like Walmart, and they're probably like, how can I speak to my team and get them to work on these projects like you've been mentioning, Greg, at Walmart? So what is your advice to them?
Well, I think I'm very fortunate that this mentality goes all the way to the top. That the course that we set on and was set on by our CEO with the full support of the board, right? And so Walmart is an enormous ship. It's a over $600 billion revenue company per year. So it's like it's turning an aircraft carrier. But boy, when you turn an aircraft carrier and set it on a new course, it's going, right? And so the challenge now is actually to figure out how do you take 1,000 ideas within Walmart and focus them towards the same goal. So across wildly different types of supply chains. So when you talk cocoa, you're talking a very different business than when you're talking, say, poultry. They're just not even the same. So how do you take the context, the complexity of the systems that we work in, but drive a very clear signal? I saw something in the chat saying like, how do you drive that market demand through Walmart's products? And we're trying various different things. In some cases, we have certifications that we're relying on. Cocoa would be a good example through Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade or something like that, something that we can invest in and have the certainty that a certification gives us, right? In row crops, that's typically not an available tool. And so in that case, we're having to be really creative. Some programs we're doing ourselves. We're investing in, for example, we have a vertically lined beef supply chain that that has a feedlot in Nebraska that we're working with the farmers that surround that feedlot that actually sell most of their corn, or most of the feedlot's corn come from those local farmers. So there's a risk factor that's very localized. And our thought was, well, if that's true and that's a durable market relationship, we actually have one of the few places where we can plug in and help those specific farmers in that locality adopt more regenerative farming systems, raise their resilience, right, within to severe weather and other types of risk, and have a more stable supply chain for our beef cattle that go through that feedlot, right? That's one way to do it, is very pick out where that connection exists and then invest in it, because you're going to get the return in terms of resiliency and future productivity. When you're further away from it, like snack business and things like that, it's a bit harder. So in that case, we've invested alongside some of our leading business partners like General Mills and PepsiCo in their programs, trying to bring those to scale, and then putting out the call to the rest of the supply chain, like, hey, we built this really good program. It's been piloted. It's now been scaled. We've worked out the kinks, and we're getting pretty good, deliverables and outcomes for the amount that we're putting in. You should join us, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we're going to take this and try to send that market signal. But unfortunately, it is going to be supply chain specific. It's going to be context specific. And for farmers like Bill, where you're sending most of your stuff down the river to markets unknown, the demand signal is just going to be very weak there. And I haven't figured out how we can send a better signal other than joining with as many different off-takers in a particular landscape to have a clear vision of what we need to do, and then align our programs together to not necessarily be doing all the same thing, but definitely driving towards the same goal. So that message, at least, and that market signal is sent in concert from as many different points as possible. And that's the benefit of a landscape scale collaboration and a landscape focus, because most farmers don't sell to one specific off-taker. Most farmers sell to a market, a very opaque market. So we have to have a demand signal that is landscape led, not you're my farm, you're my farmer, I'm going to invest in you, because that's not really how it works in the commodity system.
Yeah, I think the landscape and place-based sourcing is a really interesting one. We've been holding a sustainable commodities and landscapes conference for a few years and trying to see, because we saw, 5-6 years ago that this is the sort of conversation we should be having at a landscape level. And then at the Future of Food conference a few weeks ago, where Mike and the team were there as well, we saw like a lot more conversation on this place-based sort of sourcing practices. So, and there's a lot of questions as well from the audience of this webinar on this. I wonder if maybe from your perspective, Bill or John, like, how are you working with other farmers in your landscape, in your vicinity, to scale these practices together? Maybe share a little bit more on that while I pull up my blinds, because I'm getting all white.
My biggest way is just I share what I have going on, and I share the pitfalls, and I share the whole path and the whole story. And the biggest thing is sharing the why. People can relate to whys, and especially in agriculture. We're all on the same common page. We all do it because we love it. It's a lifestyle. It's not a job. It's not a career. It is a way of life, and for a lot of people, it's the only one they know. Really, it's just communicating with them, bringing them out, showing them, and really taking the time to just talk with them and see what their stopping points are, see why they're interested, and try and not get them to adopt the practices, but show them success through my practices that would lead to their adoption.
Yeah, Bill.
And on my point, as in, today's technical world, Facebook, sharing pictures there, going back and forth with the commenters on that. And as I've said before, the area I'm in, if is a bit challenged with starting with regenerative practices. It's not big in my area at all. As in we've said before, it's kind of what's always been done. And if anyone steps out and tries something new, oh, how dare you? And so it is a challenge, and it will be a challenge for the next few years. And being openly talking, making sure all of the good and bad is fully explained, and just knowing that there's a support group that if another farmer tries it, hey, I'm here, I've tried it, we can learn from each other. So just communicating is the big thing, and just being open and sharing ideas, mostly on Facebook is what I do.
Great. And from your perspective, Mike, how are you seeing farmers in all of those different states working to tackle this as a landscape?
I think that's something that is probably being more facilitated than it is farmer driven at this stage. But I agree with Jonathan, and as opposed to coming and saying these are practices you should be doing, do them, using kind of leading by example. And so that's where we certainly get a tremendous amount of value out of our what we call our proving ground farms, because they're large scale. We're operating at a scale that growers around us are operating at, and on the same soils and the same crop types and production methods, but introducing these regenerative systems and practices. And so we're a very open book about those farms. We share all of the information on how this is related to yield and profitability, trials we've done, what has worked, what hasn't worked. I think obviously, interestingly, I think in a space where there's a lot of temptation to only talk about the good things, what's going well, growers are often more responsive to that what didn't work, right? And that honest conversation about the things that have led to failure. And so I think using the farms as a place to bring growers together, show them what we're doing and what results we've seen is something that's been really, really effective for Vayda.
Yeah.
But I think lots of opportunity to create more forums where growers can have those kinds of interactions and work with each other and share and educate each other. It's more opportunity for that, certainly in the Delta and probably in general.
And I think the forums, like the forums and the informational places and all your field days and everything like that, are really the second step. I think that the first step starts at people's shop benches, and it starts at just talking and relating to them and finding the best way to communicate with them. Because there was a whole generation of my farmers, and my grandpa was one of them, that if he didn't like something, he got mad and took his ball and went home. That was it. He could go home and be at his farm and nobody could bother him. He didn't have a boss. He could do whatever he wanted to on that side. And that might be part of why there's 75 ag advocacy organizations. But that once you get to that point, we can't now do that. I always say that my grandpa went through the change in technology. He went through he rode on the back of a horse that pulled a plow, to before he passed away was driving a 4-wheel drive articulating tractor. So he went through, his lifespan went through such a massive technological change. My lifespan will be the social change of it. It will be the relating to consumers. It will be the talking to people. And instead of talking about constantly, how do we grow more, we need to evaluate the morality along those steps and say, how can we grow better? Rather than more, how do we grow better?
Yeah, great. I want to take the last minute just to turn to each of you for a quick 20 seconds or so, what you would want to sort of close off with to the audience, like a call to action. What do you want, one point that you want the audience to walk away with? Maybe I should start with Jonathan.
Yeah, I would just like to emphasize the communication and relationship part. Just farmers are open to change, and especially you talk to any number of younger farmers, and farmers my age are pushing for change. They're seeing it within advocacy organizations. They're starting to skew younger, getting into those leadership roles younger, and really caring about that, how we go forward and how we grow. And just taking the time to relate to those people and relate to those farmers and hear their stories. And as from the agricultural side, we need to do a better job of getting our stories out there. We can't just stay on our farms anymore. We have to be out there, and we have to be talking. We have to be part of this conversation. And we don't have to be leading and guiding the conversation down a particular path. But we have to be a part of that conversation and be willing to engage.
Thank you. Bill?
My take would be, if you have a question, just ask why. For a lot of these things, if you're curious how an operation runs or what a farmer's doing on there, for the people that's not in ag based or that is curious, drive into a farm, stop and talk. You'll be astounded how many people, just want to share your ideas. You have a lot of farmers, I guess the older generation, who's not accessible to social media, who's not up on that as of yet. And those are the ones that have the most knowledge of all, because they've been doing it. So my take would be just pull up and ask. If you're curious, ask why, and just have fun in it.
Thank you. Greg?
I think my takeaway, and this is really more for the supply chain, is to, before you jump in and create your own new program, your new pilot, take a look at what else is happening in the landscape that you're most concerned about. Figure out what programs are already out there and talk to the people who are doing them, and maybe think about joining rather than starting. And because there's a lot of benefit to working together in this space, both for economies of scale in terms of program startup and costs and things like that. But also that allows you to get a bigger megaphone for your work when multiple people and multiple organizations are talking about the same thing. If you need to get something off the ground real fast, like maybe you do want to go it alone and have that control. But quite frankly, I think the real success that we're going to have is from broad-based multi-sector coalitions that involve government, involve nonprofits, involve farmer groups, and involve as many CPGs and food companies as possible working together on the same problem. Because then you're going to get the real, not only economies of scale, but you're going to get the skill sets of partners that you don't have yourself. So think about joining and think about ways to get to scale through that.
Thank you. And then Mike, as the convener of this, close us off.
I think I would just encourage people to be okay with the fact that we can have a lot of conviction that these principles and practices are ultimately going to be better for the farm and the farm's profitability and for the environment and the climate and all of these things. We can have that conviction while also recognizing that this is hard and that implementation of these practices and the ongoing use of these practices is not straightforward, can be certainly risky for the grower. Those two ideas can coexist. And I think along with that is when we see that there are barriers to adoption and that it's not moving as quickly as we would all like, to not look at that as what I think is sometimes been the tendency is, growers are stubborn and they're resistant to change, and just kind of leaning on those myths about who the grower is and what they do and what they believe, but really looking at it, as Bill pointed out, as an opportunity for partnership and collaboration. Ask the question, understand why it's not working or why it might not make sense for that grower unless we modify our approach, and really look at it as an opportunity to engage more deeply, understand better, and be a better partner.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the last hour. I think it was worth stealing everyone's 3 extra minutes. But yeah, thank you very much to all the speakers for sharing everything and for your candor. And a big thank you to Mike, Eugenia, and Vayda and the team for making this possible. And thanks for everyone attending and your questions. I think we got over 60 questions. So I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all of them. Obviously, a lot left unanswered, and shows the importance of continuing these sort of conversations. So do get in touch with the Vayda team, with John, Bill, Greg, to continue these conversations. We'll also share this recording with you, anyone who registered, and feel free to share that more widely. And otherwise, yeah, we'll continue on our platform as well. And thanks for all your questions and everything. So see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.